The show starts off in 2015. The Department of Defense sends 2 scientists, Jonas Lear and Tim Fanning, to Bolivia to investigate rumors about a 250-year-old man who might hold the key to a groundbreaking cure. A local guide leads them to a cave but warns them to stay back while carrying a bucket of blood. Ignoring the warning, they find the man, but he turns out to be a blood-sucking creature. Suddenly, the creature attacks Fanning, and bullets prove useless against it. Clark Richards, a soldier in the group, uses a wooden stake to kill it. Fanning is then rushed to a hospital, where he miraculously recovers after a few hours. 3 years later, federal agents Brad Walgast and Phil Doyle visit a prison. They approach a death row inmate, Anthony Carter, and offer him a chance to participate in a government project called Project Noah. Brad explains that the program aims to find a cure for various deadly diseases, and could give Carter's life a new purpose. Meanwhile, at Project Noah, Jonas and a team of scientists, including Nishal Sykes and Daniel Pett, discuss the Chinese avian flu, which has become a global pandemic and killed billions. Pett shares his theory that the age of test subjects might be the key to success. He takes the team to a quarantined area where they observe Fanning, who is fully transformed into a horrific creature, along with other failed test subjects. Pett believes using a child as the next subject might work better. After some thought, Sykes agrees and orders Richards to organize a team to find a child for the experiment. The scene cuts to Tennessee, where a group of kids, including Amy Belafonte, hangs out at a fast food restaurant. While returning home, Amy comes across a crime scene and realizes her mother has died from a drug overdose. With no relatives to care for her, the police place Amy in temporary foster care. Meanwhile, Brad and Phil follow through on their mission for Project Noah by transporting Carter to the medical facility. Once the subject is taken to another section, Brad and Phil are given their next assignment by Richards to kidnap a child. They drive to Tennessee, where Amy is staying at a foster home. When she meets the agents, she immediately questions why no female social worker is with them. Suspicious, Amy then sneaks out through her bedroom window. Brad and Phil chase her through the neighborhood, and Phil soon catches her in a park. At Project Noah, Jonas tries playing music in Cell 4B, hoping Tim Fanning will respond. An employee named Gray approaches and mentions that while Fanning hasn't shown outward signs, he and others are having vivid nightmares about him. Jonas brushes it off, telling Gray not to overthink it. Meanwhile, Pett and Richards observe Shauna Babcock, a former death row inmate turned test subject. Richards later hallucinates Shauna climbing on top of him. She reveals her monstrous form with veins on her face, golden eyes, and fangs, before biting into his throat. Richards then wakes up from the nightmare, trembling with fear. Back on the road, Amy notices a freeway ad for a carnival nearby, and despite Phil's objections, Brad decides to take her there. He buys some treats for Amy, and also wins a stuffed unicorn for her. He then gets a call from his ex-wife Leela, who talks about her upcoming marriage and brings up a painful memory from their past. It turns out that they lost their little girl 3 years ago. After the call, Brad and Phil head to the restroom, where Brad knocks Phil unconscious. He then returns to Amy and decides to tell her the truth. He warns her that Colorado, where Project Noah is based, is a dangerous place and says they need to avoid it. Amy trusts Brad, and they decide to leave Phil behind. Soon, word spreads that Brad has gone rogue, and Richards is tasked with tracking him down. Meanwhile, at Project Noah in Colorado, Carter waits for his physical examination. A mysterious doctor appears, and when Carter asks for his name, the man reveals himself to be Tim Fanning. During their unsettling conversation, Fanning's mouth starts bleeding, and his eyes change color. He ominously tells Carter that things will get worse, but promises to stay by his side and assures him it will all become amazing. As his fangs extend and he snarls, Carter wakes up in a panic, realizing it was a vivid nightmare. Back on the run, Brad and Amy stop at a gas station where Brad notices his face on the news, labeled as a kidnapper. He worries about Leela's safety, so he uses a payphone to warn her about Richards. Conveniently, Richards is already at Leela's house, but she cleverly uses coded language to avoid revealing anything. Brad then notices a sheriff parked nearby. He decides to turn himself in, thinking Amy might be safer if the public knows about her. After turning himself in, both he and Amy are taken to the police station. However, Brad overhears a call between the sheriff and the Department of Defense and realizes they are in danger. Just then, Richards and his team storm the station. Things escalate when one of Richards' guys mistakenly shoots the sheriff, so Brad fights back and takes down 3 agents. Although injured, he distracts Richards and manages to escape with Amy in a stolen police car. When he spots a school bus full of students nearby, He pulls over and lies to some teachers to sneak Amy onto the bus. Once she's on board, Amy opens the emergency exit, allowing Brad to climb in after her. Later, Brad manages to steal another car, but he's losing blood and growing weaker. When Amy asks where they're going, Brad doesn't answer as he has passed out. At the same time, Richards tracks down the school bus Brad and Amy had used. At her workplace, Leela is with a patient when she gets a call from an unknown person. To her surprise, it's Amy, who says she's in Wisconsin and needs help saving Brad. Leela calmly guides Amy through the steps to treat Brad's injuries over the phone. Thanks to her instructions, Brad eventually wakes up. He then grabs the phone from Amy and smashes it to avoid tracking. He sternly orders Amy to get back in the car, and the two drive off once again. Meanwhile, Amy and Brad arrive at a remote location. They walk through a forest until they reach a house surrounded by goats. They're confronted by Brad's armed friend, Lacey Antoine, who eventually lets them inside. As Brad explains their situation, Lacey questions if it's related to his suspicious job. At Brad's request, she agrees to hide them in her home. However, Richard's team soon track them down and shove Brad and Amy in their van. Back at Project Noah, Sykes and Jonas analyze Carter's results. They're shocked to discover that Carter, who had an old football injury, has completely regenerated cartilage in the damaged area just 5 hours after being injected with the serum. This reminds Jonas of the serum sample he had received from South America, and the first time he showed it to Fanning. Both of them were amazed by its properties and believed it could be a groundbreaking discovery for a cure. In the present, Richard's team arrives at Project Noah and takes Brad and Amy to separate rooms. Meanwhile, the senior staff gathers to discuss the recent incident, where Shauna attacked and killed a janitor. Dr. Pett insists that Shauna's actions were purely instinctive and denies any possibility of higher brain function. Gray, however, shares a different perspective, explaining that Shauna likely killed the janitor because he was abusive toward her. The team then debates how to handle Shauna. Dr. Pett argues for euthanizing her, seeing her as a dangerous liability, while Sykes and Jonas oppose the idea. They insist she retains some humanity and remains vital to their research. Richards shows up at the meeting, haunted by the lie he told Shauna and the way she's been tormenting him in his nightmares. He decides to approve her euthanization, claiming it's for security reasons. Later, Richards watches Shauna Babcock in her cell during feeding time. He gives a guard instructions to prepare for her execution by gassing her and later exposing her unconscious body to intense UV lights to kill her. Shauna overhears everything and realizes her fate. When blood is poured into her feeding bowl, she refuses to move. Then, Fanning appears inside her head and acknowledges her tough situation. He advises her to focus on a plan and reminds her that her impulsiveness is her greatest flaw. He then suggests she show Richards her past to earn his sympathy. From the control room, Jonas observes the feeding session and notices that both Shauna and Fanning aren't eating. He deduces that they are communicating telepathically. Brad, meanwhile, is confined to a common room. He watches the news, which falsely claims that he was killed after murdering 3 people at a sheriff's station. Richards then brings Brad into the main corridor, where Sykes and Jonas are waiting. Sykes explains the outbreak of bird flu in Asia, which is expected to reach the US in less than 60 days. She reveals that Amy is central to their efforts to develop a treatment. Brad sees through her explanation, but makes it clear to the group that if anything happens to Amy, he'll come after them. Brad is then permission to see Amy. He finds that she already has an IV in her arm and a tracking chip in her neck. Shortly after, Sykes enters the room and opens a case containing a large syringe. Brad calms Amy by telling her to focus on him, not the syringe, as Sykes injects the serum into her IV. Meanwhile, Shauna concentrates hard on Richards and starts sending him memories of her life through a telepathic connection. She begins with Halloween 2012, when she dressed up as if she'd been shot in the head. It is revealed that she had dreams of becoming a special effects makeup artist in Los Angeles. For this, she was saving money for the move. On Halloween night at a bar, an aggressive man harassed her friend, so Shauna broke a bottle, slashed his arm, and grabbed money from the cash register before fleeing with her friends. The memory is cut short when Richard snaps out of his daze and blankly stares at a coffee maker. In Amy's room, she and Brad are playing cards when a nurse arrives to check on Amy. After the nurse leaves, Amy mentions to Brad that she overheard someone in the next room being called Anthony. Brad quickly connects the dots and realizes it's Anthony Carter, the 12th death row inmate. Later, Brad helps Amy settle into bed. However, he wakes up to find Gray standing in the room, staring at Amy. Brad chases Gray out, but the latter shakingly warns that Fanning is coming for Amy. When Brad demands answers, Gray reveals that Fanning, the first infected patient, is on level 4B. He says Fanning controls people through dreams and urges Brad to get Amy out of the facility. Guards then force Brad back into the room, but he manages to swipe a flashlight from one of them. In the meantime, Shauna shows her next memory to Richards. Her mother is furious after bailing her out of jail following the bar fight. She scolds Shauna, saying she'll never achieve anything and will just squander her money. Determined to prove her wrong, Shauna tucks her savings away under the sink. That night, Brad stays up late, waiting for the right moment to act. He hears one guard leave for a bathroom break and heads out to check on the test subjects, whom they refer to as virals kept in level 4B. During this time, Brad runs into Gray in the elevator and asks him for level 4B. When Gray hesitates, Brad pulls out a syringe and injects it into him. Gray passes out, and Brad drags him to the retina scanner. After using Gray's eye to get through, he leaves him unconscious on the floor. Next, Brad enters the dark area where the virals are held. His flashlight lands on Tim Fanning's monstrous face, who's standing right up against the glass of his cell. Just then, Jonas appears and says it's time to talk. He then shuts off the surveillance system for a few minutes. Brad is overwhelmed with guilt, realizing he played a part in turning these people into monsters. He was one of the federal agents who transported these death row inmates for the inhumane experiment. Jonas explains that the scientists tried to cure diseases, create immunity, and give people immortality, but instead, they made a new species they can't fully understand. The virals appeared lifeless at first, but now Jonas believes they're communicating with each other. Brad then asks about Fanning, and Jonas confirms that Fanning is patient 0. He tells Brad that Fanning's blood was used to create the other virals. Fanning gains more power with every new viral created. Meanwhile, Richards watches Shauna Babcock as she's prepared for execution. In a flashback, she reveals more of her painful story. The next morning after Halloween, Shauna discovers her savings are missing and confronts her stepfather, only to find out he spent it on something else. Unfortunately, her mother takes his side and ignores all the abuse Shauna has suffered. It's revealed that her stepfather sexually harassed her since she was 8 years old. Filled with anger and pain, Shauna ends up stabbing both her mother and stepfather. As Richards experiences Shauna's trauma, she is taken to the room with the UV light chamber. The lights are turned on, which instantly burns her skin. When she screams in agony, Richards snaps back to reality and shuts off the UV lights. Meanwhile, Brad returns to Amy's room and falls asleep. In his dream, he finds himself walking down the hall to see Fanning standing at the end. Fanning warns him to stay out of his way and lets out a terrifying hiss, showing his sharp teeth and glowing orange eyes. Brad then suddenly wakes up in a panic. In the next room, Carter dreams about his girlfriend, Rachel Wilson. The dream begins with them in bed together, but then it takes a dark turn when Rachel is drowned in a pool. Fanning interrupts the dream, telling Carter that it's time for him to make a choice. The following morning, Jonas studies the latest brain scans of the virals. He explains to Dr. Pett that the brain activity spikes at night when the virals experience nightmares. He also points out that Fanning's brain scan shows much higher activity than the others. Just then, Jonas is called away to speak with Brad and Sykes. Brad suggests that Amy should go outside to ease her anxiety, and they agree, as long as she's accompanied by security. In the meantime, Shauna's voice appears in Richard's head. She thanks him for stopping her execution, and warns that one of his men is about to lose control. Back in their rooms, Amy and Carter start passing notes under the adjoining door. Amy asks Carter how he's feeling, especially about his nightmares. Carter tries to reassure her, but she can tell something is wrong. During their break, Sykes asks Richards why he changed his mind about executing Shauna. Richards explains that the Department of Defense, DOD, overruled him and told him to stand down, probably because they had millions of dollars invested in each viral and didn't want to waste the money. Meanwhile, Carter's condition worsens. He's becoming sensitive to sunlight and is losing his appetite. He then drifts into a memory of meeting his girlfriend when he was trying to sell a house. She was a realtor at his open house and gave him advice on improving his presentation, including encouraging him to open his heart to love and ask her out. Suddenly, Fanning appears in his memory, praising him for asking Rachel out. Carter then wakes up, clearly startled. Amy slips a note under his door asking if he's okay. As he picks it up, blood pours from his mouth. Turns out, he's losing his first tooth to make room for fangs. That day, Amy and Brad spend a lovely afternoon in the treehouse, built by the security for Amy. She asks one of the guards to use her binoculars and observes the surroundings. Inside, Sykes calls the DOD to ask about Richard's overruled execution order, and discovers that the phone call Richards mentioned never actually happened. Meanwhile, Jonas observes that Fanning's M-surge is now 400% higher than the previous day. Unbeknownst to him, Carter is curled up on the floor and trembling in fear. The nurse and his guards find him and move him to the science levels immediately. It seems that Fanning is using all his extra energy in connection with Carter. Meanwhile, Amy is still using the guard's binoculars when she spots a man on the roof with a big gun. Brad quickly pulls her down as the sniper starts shooting. Inside, Carter's condition is getting worse. He has a high fever and shivers. He's also lost several teeth. Just then, gunshots are heard outside as Paulson starts shooting. He demands a helicopter and threatens to take down the entire compound's power supply by targeting the electric substation. When his demands aren't fulfilled, Paulson shoots out the substation, causing the compound to lose power. Consequently, Carter cannot be treated without power. Brad then offers to talk to Paulson since he's a hostage negotiator. Richards and Sykes agree to send him outside while sending Amy back inside for safety. Brad then tries to reason with Paulson, telling him that there's a medical emergency and they need to restore the power, but Paulson refuses. He reveals that he smuggled a vial of Fanning's blood out of the compound as insurance and won't tell them where it is unless they cooperate. In Carter's next memory, he has moved into a new house with Rachel. One night, she shows up with bruises on her face, and Carter is shocked to learn that she's married. He's angry that she lied to him, but he doesn't get violent. In the meantime, Brad warns Paulson that if the blood sample gets out to the public, it will be a disaster. He tries to convince the soldier that they're on the same side, explaining that he's been in level 4B with the virals and had Fanning get into his head. Paulson says they don't have much time left, and Brad offers to work together. As they talk, Richard sneaks up behind Brad and listens in. Paulson reveals that Richard saved Shauna's life after she manipulated him with her sympathetic past story. Richard suddenly appears and shoots Paulson in the forehead, killing him instantly. Brad is furious and demands to know why he did that. Richard says the negotiation took too long and orders his men to send repair teams to the power substation. In the next scene, Carter continues to see his memories. He and Rachel sit by the pool, drinking wine. She takes some pills, and when her husband calls, Carter tells him that Rachel will call back when she's ready. Rachel confesses that she thought she could end her marriage without Carter finding out, and Carter tells her he loves her, but he needs time to think. When he wakes up the next morning, he finds that Rachel has drowned herself in the pool. He rushes to pull her out and tries to revive her, but it's too late. Fanning approaches Carter as he's doing CPR on Rachel, and tells him that he understands how this situation led to Carter being sentenced to death. Rachel's wealthy husband hated both of them, and he framed Carter for hitting Rachel and drowning her on purpose. When Carter says he doesn't want to die, Fanning offers him a new life, one without pain and suffering, and with power. He tells Carter has a choice. He can die, or he can rise to the top of the food chain. But either way, his heart will stop beating in 8 seconds. Snapping back to reality, Carter regains consciousness and his eyes suddenly turn orange. He then violently rips out his IV and gives out a monstrous roar as his bloodied fangs fully form.